On the morning of September 4th, 622, or more precisely, on a date in the month of Rabi al-Awwal that would later be back calculated to correspond to that September, a middle-aged merchant from Mecca arrived at the outskirts of a dusty agricultural town called Yathrib, roughly 200 miles to the north, having fled his hometown under cover of darkness because the men who ran the city wanted him dead. He had maybe 200 followers to his name, most of them poor, a handful of them from respectable families, and not a single one of them would have described what they were doing as founding a civilization. They were survivors. They were refugees. They had been mocked, boycotted, beaten, and in some cases tortured for the better part of a decade for insisting that there was one God, that the stone idols in the Kaaba were worthless, and that the man leading them, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a formerly prosperous trader who had begun receiving what he described as direct revelations from the divine at the age of 40, was the final prophet in a line stretching back through Jesus, Moses, and Abraham. The town he was arriving at would soon be renamed Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the prophet, and within 10 years of that arrival, he would be the undisputed ruler of most of the Arabian Peninsula. Within 100 years of his death, the movement he started would stretch from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan, an empire larger than Rome at its height, assembled in roughly a quarter of the time. This is, by any reasonable measure, the most rapid large-scale political and religious expansion in human history, and the question of how it happened has haunted historians, theologians, sociologists, and polemicists for 14 centuries. The answers they have produced tell you almost as much about the people asking as about the phenomenon itself. The temptation, when confronting a story this enormous, is to start with the expansion and work backward, to begin with the cavalry charges and the falling empires, and then explain the theology as a kind of fuel that powered the engine. But that gets the sequence exactly wrong, and it misses the thing that made everything else possible. Before Islam was a conquering force, it was a community-building project of extraordinary sophistication, forged under conditions of extreme duress, in a place most of the world's great powers had written off as irrelevant. To understand the speed of the spread, you have to understand the soil it grew from, the Arabia of the early 7th century, which was not the empty wasteland of popular imagination, but a complex, commercially active, tribally organized society that was, in several critical respects, ready for exactly the kind of disruption Muhammad represented. The Arabian Peninsula in 600 CE sat at the intersection of 3 enormous spheres of influence and belonged fully to none of them. To the northwest, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern Greek-speaking remnant of Rome, controlled Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia, projecting Christian orthodoxy and Hellenistic administrative traditions across the eastern Mediterranean. To the northeast, the Sasanian Persian Empire, Zoroastrian, ancient, bureaucratically sophisticated, controlled Mesopotamia, Iran, and parts of Central Asia. These two superpowers had been grinding each other down in wars of exhaustion for generations, each one hollowing out the other's treasury and manpower without achieving anything decisive, a dynamic that would matter enormously in about 30 years, though nobody knew it yet. To the southwest, the Kingdom of Aksum, Christian Ethiopia, had at one point projected power across the Red Sea into Yemen, but by the early 7th century, its influence on the peninsula was fading. Arabia itself was governed by no state. It was organized by tribe, by kinship, by a web of alliances and blood feuds and commercial relationships that constituted a social order without constituting a government. The peninsula was not lawless. It had elaborate codes of honor, hospitality, and reciprocity, but it had no sovereign, no tax system, no standing army, barter, and no administrative apparatus beyond the tribal council and the authority of individual chiefs whose power rested on persuasion, reputation, and the willingness of their kinsmen to follow. Mecca, Muhammad's hometown, was a partial exception. It was a trading city, a node on the caravan routes linking the Indian Ocean trade with the Mediterranean. and its ruling elite, the Quraysh tribe, derived their power from a combination of commerce and custodianship of the Kaaba, a sacred shrine that housed the idols of multiple Arabian deities and served as a pilgrimage site and a neutral ground for intertribal negotiation. The Quraysh were, in effect, a merchant oligarchy wrapped in a priestly function, and they were very good at both. The sacred months, periods when fighting was forbidden and pilgrimage was encouraged, were also, not coincidentally, prime trading seasons. Religion and commerce were not just allied in Mecca, they were fused, and the fusion made the Quraysh rich, powerful, and deeply resistant to any message that threatened to upend the arrangement. This is the world Muhammad disrupted, and it matters that he disrupted it from within. He was not a foreign invader or a marginal outsider. He was a Qurayshi, from a respectable, if not dominant clan, the Banu Hashim, and he had worked the trade routes himself, married a successful businesswoman named Khadijah, who was 15 years his senior, and, by most accounts, the great stabilizing force of his early life. When the revelations began around 610 CE, experiences Muhammad described as overwhelming, even terrifying, in which the angel Gabriel delivered the words of God in Arabic. The message was, at its core, deceptively simple. There is one God, the same God worshipped imperfectly by Jews and Christians. The day of judgment is coming. The wealthy have obligations to the poor. And then the tribal idolatries and social hierarchies of Meccan life are not just wrong, but an offense against the divine order. Strip away everything that would come later, the jurisprudence, the empires, the sectarian divisions, and what you have in those earliest Meccan surahs is a searing moral critique delivered in prose of extraordinary beauty. The Quran, whatever one's theological commitments, is a masterwork of the Arabic language. Its rhythms, its rhetorical structures, its capacity to shift between tender mercy and apocalyptic warning within a single passage, and even hostile contemporary witnesses acknowledged its power. The Quraysh did not persecute Muhammad because his message was weak. They persecuted him because it was effective, because it threatened the commercial and spiritual economy on which their power rested, and because, in a society organized by lineage and rank, the claim that all human beings stood equal before a single God was not a pious abstraction, but a direct assault on the social order. The persecution was real, and it was targeted. The Quraysh could not simply kill Muhammad. Tribal custom and the protection of his uncle Abu Talib prevented that, at least initially, so they went after his followers, particularly those without powerful clan protection. Slaves who converted were tortured. Families who joined the movement were boycotted, cut off from trade and social intercourse in a campaign of economic strangulation that lasted years. There is a famous early episode, the migration of a small group of Muslims to the Christian kingdom of Aksum around 615, seeking asylum from a Christian king, that reveals something crucial about early Islam's self-understanding. It saw itself not as a repudiation of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but as its completion, and it expected, not unreasonably, that Christians and Jews would recognize the family resemblance. The Muslim envoys reportedly recited Quranic verses about Jesus and Mary to the Aksumite king, who is said to have wept, drawn a line in the sand, and declared that the difference between this faith and his own Christianity was no wider than that line. Whether the story is literally true is less important than what it reveals about how the early Muslim community positioned itself as insiders to the monotheistic tradition, not outsiders, offering correction rather than revolution. This expectation would prove partly right and mostly wrong. And the tension it created would shape the next 1400 years. But in that early moment, it was a strategic and theological instinct that gave the nascent Muslim community options, intellectual alliances, and moral claims that a purely pagan movement would not have had. When Muhammad arrived in Yathrib, Medina, in 622, the event later designated as the Hijra, the migration that marks year one of the Islamic calendar, what he found was not a city eager to adopt a new religion, but a city desperate for an arbitrator. Medina was riven by a vicious intertribal feud between its two dominant Arab tribes, the Aws and the Khazraj, a conflict that had produced a recent battle, the Battle of Bu'ath, and left the city's political fabric in tatters. The town's substantial Jewish population, three significant tribes, the Banu Qainuqa, the Banu Nadir, and the Banu Qurayza, with their own military and economic power, was entangled in the conflict through a web of alliances with one side or the other. Muhammad was invited not primarily as a prophet, but as a neutral outsider. A respected Qurayshi who might be able to mediate a conflict that was bleeding everyone. What he produced instead was something far more radical: the Constitution of Medina, a document, or more likely, a series of agreements later collected into a single text that defined a new kind of political community. It was not a tribe. It was not an empire. It was an ummah, a community defined by shared commitment rather than shared blood. Arabs and Jews, emigrants from Mecca and native Medinans, were bound together in a single political entity with mutual defense obligations, shared adjudication procedures, and, critically, Muhammad as the final arbiter of disputes. Whether you see this as the first Islamic state or simply as a very clever piece of coalition building depends on your analytical priors. But its significance is hard to overstate. In a world organized entirely by kinship, Muhammad had introduced a new organizing principle: loyalty to a covenant rather than loyalty to a bloodline, and it worked. Not perfectly and not without violence, but it worked. The Medina period, 622 to 632, the last decade of Muhammad's life, is where the religion became a polity, and the polity became a military power. And it is also where the story becomes uncomfortable for anyone who wants to fit it into a simple narrative frame. Muhammad was, during these years, simultaneously a spiritual teacher, a political leader, a military commander, a legislator, a diplomat, and a judge. And he conducted raids on Meccan trade caravans, an act of economic warfare that was entirely within the norms of Arabian tribal conflict, but that also served to sustain the financially precarious emigrant community and to demonstrate that the Quraysh's commercial lifeline was vulnerable. He fought 3 major engagements with Mecca: Badr in 624, a stunning Muslim victory against superior numbers with a force so small it should not have won, a result immediately interpreted by the community as divine vindication, and by the Quraysh as an alarming sign that this movement could not be dismissed as a nuisance. Uhud in 625, a painful defeat that tested the community's faith and produced Quranic passages addressing the theological problem of losing when God is supposedly on your side. And the Battle of the Trench in 627, where Medina's successful defense against a massive Meccan siege coalition, a force of perhaps 10,000 men, enormous by Arabian standards, broke Quraysh power permanently and demonstrated that the Muslim community could survive the worst its enemies could organize. The aftermath of the Trench also produced one of the most controversial episodes in early Islamic history: the destruction of the Banu Qurayza, the last remaining Jewish tribe in Medina who were accused of treasonous negotiation with the besieging Meccan coalition. The men of the tribe were executed, the women and children enslaved, and the property confiscated, a punishment that was, by the laws of Arabian tribal warfare, within the range of accepted practice for treason during wartime, but that has, understandably, generated intense debate among historians and theologians for centuries. The episode is a reminder that the Medina period was not a golden age of pluralistic harmony. It was a period of desperate political survival, and Muhammad made decisions during it that reflected the brutal norms of the world he inhabited. To judge him solely by modern standards is anachronistic. To refuse to judge at all is evasive. The honest path runs between those two positions. He negotiated the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in 628, a temporary peace with Mecca that looked to many of his followers like a humiliating concession. He agreed to turn back from a pilgrimage to the Kaaba and accepted terms that appeared, on their face, to favor the Quraysh. But that proved, within 2 years, to be a masterstroke of strategic patience. The treaty gave Muhammad the breathing room to consolidate alliances across Arabia, to bring wavering tribes into the Muslim orbit and to isolate Mecca diplomatically, while the Quraysh, frozen in place by the agreement, watched their alliance network erode. When the Quraysh violated the treaty's terms, Muhammad had his casus belli. Yes, and in 630, he marched on Mecca with 10,000 men and took the city almost without bloodshed, a conquest achieved more by diplomatic isolation of the enemy than by force of arms. He entered the Kaaba, smashed the idols, and declared the sanctuary purified for the worship of the one God. Most of the Quraysh converted, many of them sincerely, some of them pragmatically, all of them aware that the balance of power had shifted permanently. By the time he died in June 632, virtually every significant tribe in Arabia had submitted to Muslim authority through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, conversion, and strategic alliance, a patchwork of arrangements that held together as long as the extraordinary personality at its center was alive. Here I want to pause and introduce a framework that I think is essential to understanding not just the early expansion, but the entire phenomenon of Islam's rapid spread, because without it, you will fall into one of two equally misleading explanations. The religious explanation, which holds that Islam spread because its message was divinely true, and people recognize that truth, or the cynical materialist explanation, which holds that Islam spread because Arabs had swords and horses and the empires in their path were too exhausted to resist. Both of these contain a grain of truth, and neither is remotely sufficient. The framework is this: Islam succeeded as rapidly as it did because it was, from its inception, simultaneously a theological revolution, a social contract, and a political technology. And these three dimensions reinforced each other in ways that made the whole vastly more powerful than any one part. The theology provided meaning and motivation, a reason to fight, to sacrifice, to migrate, to build, and a cosmic narrative that made the struggle feel significant rather than arbitrary. The social contract, the Ummah concept, the legal framework, the redistribution obligations through zakat, the erasure of tribal hierarchy in favor of spiritual equality before God, provided a model of community that was genuinely more functional and more appealing than what it replaced, particularly for those who had been on the losing end of the old order. And the political technology, the flexible, the pragmatic approach to governance that could absorb conquered peoples without demanding immediate total conversion, that could co-opt existing administrative systems, that could offer structured terms of coexistence to religious minorities, provided the mechanism for scaling. Most religious movements have one of these, some have two. Islam, in its first century, had all three operating in concert, and that convergence, that mutual reinforcement between belief, belonging, and governance explains the speed better than any single factor. The theological revolution was real, and it is a mistake, a common secular mistake, born of the assumption that material interests always trump spiritual ones, to dismiss it as merely incidental to the political story. The Quran offered a vision of the cosmos that was, for its time and place, erratically egalitarian. All human beings stood in the same relationship to God. Tribal aristocracy was meaningless before the divine. The wealthy were obligated to the poor through zakat, the mandatory alms tax that was not charity but a structural redistribution mechanism built into the religion's basic requirements. The 5 daily prayers, performed in rows where rich and poor stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction, performing the same movements, were a daily physical enactment of a social vision in which hierarchy dissolved before the divine. For the poor, the enslaved, the tribally marginal, the women trapped in the most exploitative pre-Islamic practices, female infanticide, unlimited polygamy without legal protections, complete exclusion from inheritance. This was not an abstraction. It was a direct material promise, a promise that this community would be different, that the God who made you would not allow the powerful to crush you without consequence. The first generation of converts included a striking number of people from exactly these categories. Bilal ibn Rabah, an Abyssinian slave who became the first muezzin, whose voice calling the faithful to prayer from the rooftop of the mosque became one of the defining sounds of the new civilization. Sumaya bint Kayat, a former slave who is traditionally counted as the first martyr, killed by a Qurayshi chief for refusing to renounce her faith. Numerous women, freed people, and members of minor clans who found in the Ummah a social space that the old tribal order had denied them. This is not to say Islam eliminated all hierarchies. It did not. And the patriarchal and slave-holding dimensions of early Muslim society are well documented and cannot be wished away. But it is to say that the gap between what Islam promised and what it delivered was, in its earliest decades, narrower than it would ever be again, and that gap, that livable proximity between ideal and practice, was an enormous engine of conversion and loyalty. The social contract dimension is what made the Medina experiment exportable. When Muslim armies, and it is important to call them armies because after 632 this was very much a military expansion, whatever else it also was, moved beyond Arabia, they carried with them not just a religion, but a system. Conquered peoples were not, in the main, forced to convert. This is one of the most consequential and most misunderstood aspects of the early Islamic expansion, and getting it wrong distorts everything that follows. The system that emerged, and it emerged pragmatically through practice and precedent rather than from a single master plan, offered conquered populations a structured set of options. Christians, Jews, and later Zoroastrians and others could retain their faith and their internal community governance by accepting the status of dhimmis, protected peoples, and paying the jizya, a poll tax that was simultaneously a marker of subordination and a guarantee of protection and exemption from military service. Muslims paid zakat and were expected to serve in the military when called. The economic calculus was, for many communities, close to neutral or even favorable. The jizya was often less onerous than the taxes levied by the Byzantine or Sasanian states it replaced, and the new rulers, at least in the early decades, were less interested in micromanaging the religious lives of their subjects than the Byzantine church-state apparatus had been. Conversion happened, but it happened over generations, not at sword point. And it was driven by a complex mixture of genuine belief, social advantage, tax incentives, intermarriage, the influence of Sufi preachers, and the simple gravitational pull of belonging to the ruling community. The historian Richard Bulliet's pioneering work on conversion curves, based on analysis of naming patterns in genealogical records across the Islamic world, suggests that in most conquered territories, Muslims did not become the majority population until 2 or 3 centuries after the initial conquest. Iran appears to have reached a Muslim majority around the mid-9th century, Egypt perhaps not until the 10th or 11th. The speed of the political expansion and the speed of the religious conversion were 2 fundamentally different phenomena operating on 2 very different timescales. These and confusing them, treating the conquests as if they automatically produced Muslim populations, is the single most common error in popular accounts of Islamic history. But the political expansion, the conquests themselves, still require explanation, because their speed and scale are genuinely astonishing even after you account for the theological and social dimensions. In 632, Muhammad died, and the community he had built nearly died with him. Many of the tribal alliances that constituted Islamic Arabia were alliances with Muhammad personally, not with a state or an institution, and when he died without designating a successor whose authority was recognized by everyone, a failure that would haunt Islam forever, tribes across the peninsula began defecting. Some refused to pay zakat, arguing that their obligation had been to Muhammad personally. Some followed rival prophets, Musaylima in the Yamama region, Sajah bint al-Harith in the northeast, who claimed their own revelations and saw no reason why the prophetic franchise should be a Qurayshi monopoly. Others simply reasserted their tribal independence. This was the Ridda, the wars of apostasy, and the man who fought them was Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, Muhammad's father-in-law, closest companion, and the first caliph, a figure whose mild personal demeanor and reputation for emotional sensitivity masked an absolutely iron political will. Was Abu Bakr's decision to treat the refusal to pay zakat not as a political disagreement, but as apostasy equivalent to renouncing Islam, and to prosecute it with overwhelming military force under the generalship of Khalid ibn al-Walid, was one of the most consequential decisions in world history. It established the principle that the Ummah was a political community with enforceable obligations, not a voluntary association from which one could withdraw at will. It reunified Arabia under Muslim control within roughly 2 years of campaigns that were, in places, extremely bloody. And, almost as a side effect, it created a military machine, a large, battle-hardened, tribally diverse Arab fighting force that now needed somewhere to direct its energy, and whose tribal leaders understood that the surest way to prevent another round of internal fragmentation was to point that energy outward. This is where the two exhausted superpowers enter the story, and their exhaustion cannot be overstated. The Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628 was one of the most destructive conflicts in late antiquity, a generation-long struggle that makes the 30 Years' War look restrained by comparison. The Sassanians had, in a spectacular burst of overreach, conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt from the Byzantines, sacking Jerusalem in 614, carrying off the relic of the true cross, massacring or enslaving tens of thousands of Christians before the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, operating from the edge of desperation, launched a counter-offensive that eventually broke Sassanian power. Heraclius recovered his lost provinces, but the cost was staggering on both sides: treasuries drained, populations displaced, frontier defenses gutted, infrastructure destroyed, and plague, probably bubonic, sweeping through both empires and their subject populations. In the Sassanian case, the aftermath was catastrophic. A succession crisis that produced something like a dozen rulers in 4 years as the empire tore itself apart from within, a feudal military aristocracy that could no longer be coordinated by a central authority, and a subject population, particularly in Mesopotamia, that had no particular loyalty to the Zoroastrian ruling class and no reason to fight for an empire that had done nothing for them in living memory. When Arab armies appeared on the borders of both empires in the 630s, they were not facing the Rome and Persia of legend. They were facing the hollowed-out shells of empires that had spent 30 years inflicting maximum damage on each other, and whose populations, taxed, conscripted, plagued, and in many cases persecuted for their religious beliefs by their own governments, were in no mood to die defending the old order. The timing was, depending on your theology, either providential or extraordinarily lucky. Depending on your cynicism, it was both. The military campaigns themselves were conducted with a speed and decisiveness that still impresses military historians. Under Khalid ibn al-Walid, a former Qurayshi cavalry commander who had fought against the Muslims at Uhud before converting in 629, a man whose tactical brilliance was matched by a reputation for ruthlessness that made even his fellow commanders uneasy, and whom Muhammad himself had reportedly called the Sword of God, Arab forces struck simultaneously into Byzantine Syria and Sasanian Iraq. The logistics alone were remarkable. These were armies operating across vast distances in extreme heat, with supply lines that stretched back into a peninsula that had no surplus agricultural production, sustained by a combination of tribal provisioning, captured supplies, and sheer momentum. The Battle of Ajnadain in 634 broke the initial Byzantine resistance in Palestine, but the decisive moment came in August 636 at the Battle of Yarmouk, fought over 6 days in a river valley near the modern Jordanian-Syrian border. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had assembled the largest army he could manage. Estimates range wildly, but it was substantially larger than the Arab force, and sent it south to crush the invasion before it could consolidate. What followed was a disaster, a combination of tactical mistakes, a blinding sandstorm that may have favored the Arab forces, and what appears to have been a general collapse of Byzantine morale produced a rout. The Byzantine field army in Syria was effectively destroyed, and with it, the empire's capacity to defend the province. Syria fell. Palestine fell. Jerusalem surrendered in 637 to the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who reportedly entered the city on foot, wearing simple clothes, and refused to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, lest his followers turn it into a mosque, a gesture that was either genuine humility or brilliant political theater, or, as is so often the case with foundational stories, both at the same time. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the Sasanian Empire was collapsing even faster. The Battle of Qadisiyah, fought in 636 or 637, the exact date, the exact location, and the exact size of the armies are all disputed, shattered the main Sasanian field army and opened the road to the capital at Ctesiphon, one of the greatest cities in the world, which the Arabs captured and looted. The treasures they found there, the jeweled carpets, the golden throne, the accumulated wealth of centuries, passed into legend and, more practically, into the Caliphate treasury. The last Sasanian emperor, Yazdegerd III, spent the next 15 years fleeing eastward through his disintegrating empire, desperately trying to rally resistance, finding that each province he reached had either already submitted, been conquered, or descended into its own local chaos. He was murdered in 651, probably by a local miller near the city of Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, killed not by Arabs, but by one of his own subjects. For what was in his pockets? An empire that had lasted 400 years was simply gone, and the speed of its disappearance tells you something important about how hollow it had become. Egypt fell to Arab forces under Amr ibn al-As between 639 and 642. Its Byzantine garrison unable to mount effective resistance and hampered by a population, native Coptic Christians, that had been persecuted as heretics by Byzantine orthodoxy for generations and saw no particular reason to risk their lives defending an empire that had spent the last 2 centuries trying to force them to accept the Chalcedonian definition of Christ's nature. The Copts did not in the main welcome the Arab conquerors as liberators. That is a later romanticization, but they offered what might be called strategic indifference, which was nearly as useful. North Africa took longer. The Berber tribes of the Maghreb fought hard and repeatedly, producing one of the most fascinating and undertold chapters of the entire expansion. Berber resistance was fierce, extended, and repeatedly successful in the short term. There are traditions of a Berber warrior queen named Dihya, or Kahina, who defeated Arab armies and ruled an independent territory for years before her final defeat. But over time, conversion and co-optation achieved what military force alone could not. And by the early 8th century, the Berbers were not merely subjects of the Muslim Empire, but enthusiastic participants in it. It was a Berber Arab force under Tariq ibn Ziyad, himself possibly a Berber freedman, though the sources are contradictory, that crossed the strait in 711 and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom of Spain in a single devastating campaigning season. The name Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, or the Mountain of Tariq, remains as a geological monument to a conquest that the conqueror could not have imagined would still be remembered 14 centuries later. In the east, Arab armies pushed through Iran into Central Asia, clashing with Turkic peoples on the steppe, and reaching, in 751, the borders of Tang Dynasty China at the Battle of Talas, a relatively small engagement whose strategic consequences were enormous, as it determined that Central Asia would fall into the Islamic rather than the Chinese cultural sphere. In the southeast, Muhammad ibn Qasim conquered Sindh, modern-day Pakistan, in 711, the same year Tariq landed in Spain, in a pincer movement of expansion that was not centrally coordinated, but that reflected the extraordinary centrifugal energy of the early Islamic polity. All of this happened within roughly 80 years of Muhammad's death. The sheer territorial scope, from the Pyrenees to the Punjab, from the Aral Sea to the cataracts of the Nile, is difficult to process even as a simple geographic fact, let alone as a political and cultural achievement. But the conquests, spectacular as they were, are only half the story, and arguably the less interesting half. The harder, more consequential question is, why did it stick? Plenty of empires have conquered vast territories with stunning speed. The Mongols would do it 5 centuries later on an even larger scale, and then watch them fragment within a generation. The Arab Islamic expansion produced something durable, a civilization that, despite enormous internal conflicts, maintained a recognizable cultural and religious coherence across a territory stretching from Iberia to India for centuries. This is the part that cannot be explained by military prowess alone, and it returns us to the political technology dimension of the framework. The early Caliphate, particularly under Umar ibn al-Khattab, who ruled from 634 to 644, and who was, whatever else one says about him, one of the great state builders in human history, a man who combined personal austerity with administrative genius, developed a remarkably pragmatic approach to governing conquered territories. Arab Muslim soldiers were, in the initial decades, deliberately separated from the conquered populations. They were settled in garrison cities, Amsar, purpose-built urban centers like Kufa and Basra in Iraq, Fustat in Egypt, and later Kairouan in Tunisia, that served simultaneously as military bases, administrative centers, and social experiments in the new Islamic order. The conquered populations kept their own laws, their own religious leaders, their own internal governance structures, their own languages. What changed was the top layer. The tax collector was now an Arab Muslim. The army defending the territory was now an Arab Muslim army, and the political authority in whose name both operated claimed divine sanction of a different character than the Byzantine emperor or the Sasanian Shah had claimed. But at the level of the village, the farm, the marketplace, the church, the synagogue, the fire temple, day-to-day life continued with a degree of continuity that is genuinely remarkable given the scale of the political upheaval. This was not tolerance in the modern liberal sense. Dhimmi status was a form of structured subordination. The jizya was a tangible economic and symbolic reminder that non-Muslims occupied a lower rung in the political hierarchy, and there were restrictions on building new houses of worship, on public religious display, on testimony in courts against Muslims. But it was, compared to the alternatives on offer in the 7th century world, Byzantine suppression of Monophysite and Nestorian Christians, Sasanian Zoroastrian orthodoxy that marginalized its own religious minorities, the forced conversions and expulsions that would characterize later periods of European Christian history, a relatively functional system for managing religious diversity. And it produced something most conquest-based empires failed to achieve: acquiescence, shading into acceptance, shading over generations into identification. The administrative flexibility went deeper than religious policy. The early Caliphate, far from imposing a single bureaucratic template across its domains, essentially co-opted existing administrative systems wholesale. In the former Byzantine provinces, the government continued to function in Greek, using Byzantine tax rolls and Byzantine administrative categories, staffed in many cases by the same Christian bureaucrats who had served the emperor, men who changed their political loyalty without changing their desks. In the former Sasanian territories, the same process unfolded in Persian, with Zoroastrian or recently converted Persian administrators running the machinery of government according to procedures that predated the conquest by centuries. Arabic became the language of the ruling elite and the language of religion, but it took decades, in some areas, generations, for it to penetrate the administrative apparatus. The Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan's decision to Arabize the bureaucracy and the coinage in the 690s, replacing Greek and Persian with Arabic in official documents, minting coins with Quranic inscriptions instead of imperial portraits, was a late reform, not an initial condition, and it was controversial precisely because it disrupted arrangements that had been working perfectly well. The pragmatism of this approach, the willingness to use whatever worked, to leave functioning systems intact, to prioritize revenue collection and political stability over ideological consistency, was not glamorous, and it does not make for exciting storytelling, but it was devastatingly effective as a method of imperial consolidation. Empires that try to remake everything at once tend to break. The early Caliphate remade almost nothing at first and let the deeper transformations happen gradually. And here, a second observation becomes essential, because the narrative of rapid, triumphant expansion can easily obscure the enormous internal conflicts that were shaping the Islamic polity from its very first decade. Conflicts that would define the civilization as profoundly as any external conquest. The community that conquered half the known world was simultaneously tearing itself apart over questions that Muhammad's death had left unresolved. Above all, the question of who had the right to lead the Ummah. Abu Bakr's selection as caliph was contested from the moment it happened. A faction centered initially on the figure of Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin, son-in-law, father of his only surviving grandsons, and in the eyes of his supporters, or the Prophet's clearly designated heir, held that the leadership should not have been open to selection at all. Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman ibn Affan, the first three caliphs, all took power through different mechanisms and under different circumstances, and the last two were both assassinated, Umar by a Persian slave with a personal grievance in 644, and Uthman by a mob of disaffected soldiers from Egypt in 656. Uthman's murder was the crack in the wall through which an enormous amount of future history would pour. When Ali finally became caliph in 656, his short reign was consumed by civil war, the first fitna, a conflict that pitted Muslim against Muslim, companion of the Prophet against companion of the Prophet, and produced battles. Camel. The Siffin, where men who had prayed side by side with Muhammad tried to kill each other in disputes over justice, legitimacy, and the proper order of the community. Ali was assassinated in 661 by a Kharijite, a member of a radical egalitarian faction that rejected both Ali and his rival Muawiyah, insisting that any pious Muslim could be caliph, and that leaders who compromised with injustice had forfeited their authority and their lives. The subsequent rise of the Umayyad dynasty under Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, a man whose father, Abu Sufyan, had been the leader of the Qurayshi opposition to Muhammad for most of the Meccan period before converting very late and very conveniently, a fact that Muawiyah's critics never tired of mentioning, transformed the Caliphate from something like an elected leadership of a religious community into something that looked much more like a conventional hereditary monarchy, with its capital not in Medina but in Damascus, staffed by former Byzantine administrators, decorated with Roman-style mosaics, and operating with a frankly imperial conception of power that would have been recognizable to any Roman governor. This horrified many Muslims, and not just the partisans of Ali. The massacre of Ali's son Husayn and his small band of followers at Karbala in 680, surrounded by Umayyad troops, vastly outnumbered, denied water, and then cut down in what was less a battle than an execution, with Husayn's severed head sent to the Umayyad Caliph Yazid in Damascus, became the founding trauma of Shia Islam and one of the most emotionally potent narratives in all of Islamic civilization, commemorated annually in the rituals of Ashura, with a grief that is not diminished in 13 centuries. The point is not to adjudicate who was right in these disputes. The literature on that question is vast and inconclusive and largely determined by sectarian starting points, but to insist on the structural observation. The expansion happened not in spite of these internal conflicts, but alongside them, sometimes even because of them. The forward momentum of conquest provided spoils, purpose, and a unifying external project that partially compensated for the centrifugal forces tearing at the community from within. War is a terrible way to build political cohesion. It is also, historically, an extremely effective one. The Umayyad period, 661 to 750, is when the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, and also when many of the structures that would define Islamic civilization for centuries were established or consolidated. But the Umayyads never fully solved their legitimacy problem. They were too worldly for the pious, too Arab for the converts, too Damascene for the Medinans, too compromised by their family's late conversion for those who measured worth by proximity to the prophet. And in 750, they were overthrown in a revolution that was simultaneously a dynastic coup, a social movement of non-Arab Muslim converts demanding equality, a Shia-adjacent uprising that exploited Alid sympathies without ultimately serving Alid interests, and a geographic reorientation of the empire from Syria to Iraq. The Abbasid dynasty, claiming descent from Muhammad's uncle Abbas, a lineage that gave them proximity to the prophet without the specifically Alid claims that would have alienated Sunni opinion, built a new capital, Baghdad, founded in 762 by the Caliph al-Mansur on the banks of the Tigris, designed as a perfect circle, a round city that was simultaneously a practical administrative center and a symbolic statement about cosmic order. The Abbasid synthesis, Arab religion, Persian administrative and literary culture, Greek philosophical and scientific traditions, transmitted through Syriac Christian translators, Indian mathematical innovations, produced what is sometimes called the Islamic Golden Age, a period of extraordinary intellectual achievement that gave the world algebra, algorithms, optics, advanced medicine, philosophy that preserved and extended the Greek tradition during the centuries when Western Europe had largely lost access to it. But even as the Abbasids presided over this flowering, their political authority was fragmenting. An Umayyad survivor established an independent emirate in Spain. Independent dynasties peeled off in North Africa, in eastern Iran, in Egypt, and the Caliphate gradually devolved from a functioning empire into something more like a symbolic institution, a spiritual figurehead whose authority was increasingly nominal, while real power was exercised by Turkish military commanders, Persian viziers, and various regional strongmen who found it useful to claim the caliph's blessing without obeying his commands. This political fragmentation, paradoxically, did not halt the spread of Islam. If anything, it accelerated it, because the mechanisms of spread shifted from military conquest to more diffuse and, in many ways, more durable modes of transmission. From roughly the 10th century onward, Islam's geographic expansion was driven increasingly by three forces: trade, Sufi mysticism, and the slow cultural gravity of a civilization that, whatever its political divisions, constituted the most economically dynamic and intellectually sophisticated zone in the medieval world. The Islam that reached Indonesia, which is today the most populous Muslim majority country on earth, with over 230 million Muslims, arrived not with armies, but with merchants, particularly traders from Gujarat and the Hadramaut coast of Yemen, who established commercial networks in the port cities of Sumatra and Java, married into local ruling families, and brought with them not the hard-edged legalism of the urban ulama, but the flexible, accommodating spirituality of Sufi practice, which could absorb and reinterpret local customs, honor local saints, and present Islam not as a radical rupture with the past, but as a deepening of spiritual truths that the local culture already intuited. The Islam that took root in West Africa, in the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, in the trading cities of Timbuktu and Jenne and Kano, came along the trans-Saharan trade routes, carried by Berber and Arab merchants and scholars whose faith was inseparable from their commercial identity. And it blended with local religious practices in ways that would have horrified a purist in Baghdad or Cairo, but that produced thriving, intellectually vibrant Muslim communities across the Sahel. Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, during which he reportedly distributed so much gold in Cairo that he depressed the local gold market for a decade, was both a display of personal piety and a statement that the Islamic world extended far beyond the old Arab-Persian core. The Islam that shaped the Swahili coast of East Africa, the Malay world, the Volga Bulgars, the peoples of the Maldives and the Indian Ocean littoral, in each case, the vector was commerce and spiritual persuasion rather than conquest, and the resulting Muslim cultures were as diverse as the societies that produced them. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult for any single cause explanation, and where intellectual honesty requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. If Islam spread by the sword, how do you explain Indonesia, which was never conquered by a Muslim army? If it spread purely by trade, how do you explain Syria and Egypt, which were conquered by military force and where conversion nonetheless took centuries? If it spread because of its theological message, why did conversion rates vary so enormously across territories that received the same message? If it spread because the empires in its path were weak, why did it continue to expand for a millennium after those empires had ceased to exist in every direction into territories with no connection to Byzantine or Sasanian decline? The honest answer is that Islam's spread is a sentence that conceals a dozen different phenomena operating on different timescales, in different geographies, through different mechanisms, among different populations and for different reasons. The Arab conquests of the 7th century were a distinct phenomenon from the gradual conversion of Persian elites in the 8th and 9th centuries, which was a distinct phenomenon from the Islamization of the Berbers, which was a distinct phenomenon from the commercial spread of Islam into Southeast Asia, which was a distinct phenomenon from the Turkic adoption of Islam on the Central Asian steppe, itself driven partly by the strategic calculation that joining the Islamic world opened access to trade networks, diplomatic alliances, and a legitimating ideology for state building. And to speak of Islam spreading as if it were a single process with a single explanation is like speaking of water moving without distinguishing between a tidal wave, a river, rainfall, and condensation on a cold glass. The underlying substance is recognizably the same. Everything else, the mechanism, the speed, the force, the direction, is different. And yet, and this is the paradox that any honest account must sit with, there is a recognizable coherence to the result. For all the diversity of mechanisms and motivations, for all the centuries and continents and cultures involved, what emerged across this vast territory was something that, however loosely, held together as a civilization. A Muslim in 12th century Cordoba, and a Muslim in 12th century Delhi, and a Muslim in 12th century Timbuktu prayed in the same direction. I fasted during the same month, recited the same Quran in the same Arabic, regardless of whether Arabic was their native language, acknowledged the same prophetic tradition, accepted the same basic legal categories, and could, in principle, travel from one end of the Islamic world to the other and find recognizable institutions, recognizable rituals, recognizable frameworks of meaning wherever they went. This was not a unified state. By the 12th century, there was nothing remotely resembling one. But it was a civilization in the deepest sense of that word, a shared set of references, obligations, aesthetics, and aspirations that created a common cultural space across an astonishing diversity of languages, ethnicities, and political arrangements. The Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, obligatory for every Muslim who can afford it, was both the symbol and the mechanism of this unity, a massive annual gathering that brought together Africans and Persians and Turks and Indians and Malays and Europeans and Central Asians, all circling the same stone building, wearing the same simple garments, performing the same rites, temporarily stripped of every marker of rank and origin, and then returning home carrying ideas, goods, scholarly connections, and commercial relationships that stitched the Islamic world together in ways that no political authority could have achieved or maintained. What made this coherence possible was, ultimately, the characteristic that distinguished Islam most sharply from Christianity as it had developed in the West: the refusal to separate the sacred from the legal, the spiritual from the social, the individual conscience from the collective obligation. Islam was from its inception, and here I am describing the tradition's self-understanding, not making a normative claim about what religion should be, a comprehensive system. The Quran addresses not just theology and personal ethics, but inheritance law, commercial contracts, dietary regulations, criminal punishment, the rules of evidence, the conduct of warfare, the treatment of prisoners, the obligations of rulers to the ruled. The Hadith, the collected sayings and actions of the Prophet, only compiled and painstakingly authenticated over the first several centuries through a remarkably rigorous system of isnad analysis, evaluating the reliability of each link in the chain of transmission, provided a vast body of precedent that could be applied, by analogy and reasoning, to virtually any situation that the founding texts had not explicitly addressed. The four great Sunni schools of jurisprudence, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and their Shia counterparts, developed sophisticated methodologies for extracting legal rulings from these sources, methodologies that allowed for regional variation, scholarly disagreement, and adaptation to local custom, while maintaining the fundamental claim that the ultimate source of law was divine revelation as interpreted by qualified scholars. This was not theocracy in the crude sense. The caliphs, sultans, and emirs who actually held political power were, in practice, far more interested in revenue, military force, and dynastic survival than in jurisprudential niceties. And the tension between the ruler's de facto power and the scholar's claim to religious authority was a permanent structural feature of Islamic political life. But the practical consequence was that wherever Islam went, it carried with it a self-contained legal and social order that could function independently of any particular political arrangement. You did not need a caliph in Baghdad or a sultan in Cairo to be a Muslim in Mombasa or Manila. You needed a Quran, a community, and a scholar who knew the law. This portability, this ability to generate functional social order, adjudicate disputes, or regulate commerce and provide a framework of meaning without requiring a centralized state, was perhaps Islam's greatest competitive advantage as a civilizational system, and it is the deepest structural reason for the durability of its spread. But durability is not the same thing as inevitability, and it would be dishonest to tell this story without acknowledging the losses, the reversals, and the costs, both to others and to the tradition itself. Islam was expelled from most of the Iberian Peninsula over the course of the Reconquista, a centuries-long process that ended with the fall of Granada in 1492, and was followed by forced conversions, inquisitorial persecution, and eventual expulsion that liquidated one of the most creative, pluralistic, and intellectually productive Muslim societies in history, a society that had produced some of the finest philosophy, poetry, architecture, and science of the medieval world, gone in a generation. Islam receded in Sicily, in Crete, in parts of the Balkans, in other territories where it had once been established or dominant. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, when Hulagu Khan's army sacked the Abbasid capital, killed the last caliph by wrapping him in a carpet and trampling him with horses, and reportedly turned the Tigris black with ink from the destroyed libraries and red with the blood of the slaughtered, was a civilizational catastrophe of the first order, a wound to Islamic intellectual and political life from which the Eastern heartland took generations to recover. And the internal costs were real and ongoing. The sectarian division between Sunni and Shia hardened into a permanent fracture that would produce, across the centuries, periodic eruptions of intra-Muslim violence. The theoretical egalitarianism of the Quran coexisted for a millennium with the institution of slavery, including a massive and under-acknowledged trade in enslaved Africans. The dhimmi system, functional at its best, could and did shade into genuine oppression, confiscatory taxation, and periodic violence, depending on the ruler and the period. And the status of women, which may genuinely have been improved by early Islam relative to the worst pre-Islamic Arabian practices, was progressively constrained by legal developments, cultural norms, and patriarchal interpretations that the tradition's own egalitarian impulses would seem to challenge. The story of Islam's spread is, in the end, a story about the interaction between an extraordinarily powerful idea and a world that was, in specific and contingent ways, receptive to that idea, not because people were passive recipients waiting to be convinced, but because the idea, in its various dimensions, offered solutions to problems they actually had. For the tribally fragmented Arabs, it offered a supra-tribal identity that could organize political life at a scale the old kinship systems could not achieve. For the subjects of exhausted, overtaxing empires, it offered lighter governance, lower taxes, and an end to religious persecution. For the commercially active peoples of the Indian Ocean and the Saharan trade routes, it offered a shared legal and ethical framework that reduced transaction costs across vast distances and created networks of trust between strangers. For the spiritually searching, it offered a direct, unmediated relationship with God. No priesthood, no sacraments, no complicated theology of incarnation or Trinity, just the stark simplicity of Tawhid, the oneness of God, and the individual's submission to that oneness. For the politically ambitious, it offered a legitimating ideology that could sanctify power while imposing obligations on the powerful. For the poor, it offered a God who noticed them, who demanded that the wealthy share, and who promised that the hierarchies of this world were temporary and false. Not all of these things were true for all people at all times, and the distance between Islam's ideals and its practices has been, as in every other civilization, every other religious tradition, every other human attempt to organize collective life around transcendent principles, the source of perpetual tension, criticism, reform, and counter-reform. But the package, the simultaneously theological, legal, social, commercial, political, and spiritual package, the total system that could be carried in a book and a set of practices rather than requiring an army or a bureaucracy, was, in the competitive environment of late antique and medieval civilizations, an extraordinarily compelling proposition. It did not have to be perfect. It just had to be better than the available alternatives for enough people in enough places at enough moments, and for a very long stretch of history. Across a very large portion of the inhabited world, it was. What remains, after all the armies and the trade routes and the legal schools and the Sufi lodges and the conversion curves and the dynastic revolutions and the theological debates and the destroyed libraries and the built mosques, is a question that historical method can frame but cannot finally answer. Was it the message or the moment? Was there something in the content of the revelation itself, its clarity, its comprehensiveness, its extraordinary beauty in Arabic, its uncompromising monotheism, its vision of human equality before a God who is closer to you than your jugular vein, that would have produced a comparable result under any historical conditions? Or was the spread fundamentally a product of timing, geography, imperial collapse, trade routes, military innovation, and the contingent genius of particular individuals making particular decisions in particular moments? Muslims have, for 14 centuries, answered that the success of Islam is itself evidence of its truth, that the sheer improbability of a middle-aged merchant from a marginal desert city transforming the political, spiritual, and cultural landscape of half the world within a single generation can only be explained as the work of God. Secular historians have, with equal conviction, pointed to the structural conditions and argued that no supernatural explanation is required, that given the state of the world in the 7th century, some force was going to fill the vacuum, and Islam happened to be the one that did. The honest position, it seems to me, is that both of these accounts are describing real phenomena, and neither is describing the whole thing. The conditions were necessary but not sufficient. 100 other movements could have exploited the same power vacuum and did not produce anything comparable. The message was powerful but not self-executing. It needed carriers, organizers, soldiers, administrators, merchants, and mystics to move it through the world. What happened was the collision of an idea of extraordinary force with a world of extraordinary fragility, mediated by human beings who were, as human beings always are, simultaneously noble and brutal, visionary and self-interested, faithful and calculating. The result was not what anyone planned, not what anyone fully controlled, and not what anyone, standing in Medina in 622, watching a tired, hunted man ride into town on the back of a camel to settle someone else's tribal dispute, could possibly have foreseen.